They didn't create Earth. They expanded into it. Buried in the oldest Sumerian tablets is a claim so explosive it shatters everything we think we know. Earth wasn't the center of the Anunnaki story. It was just one colony in a network that stretched beyond our sky. If that's true, then the real question isn't why they came here, it's what happened to the others. If you're listening to this in the quiet hours, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment telling us your location and what time it is. There's something appropriate about exploring ancient records in the stillness when most are asleep. These texts have waited millennia in darkness themselves. The Prism's opening line presents a problem that has unsettled scholars since its translation. Written in Sumerian, the language that predates Akkadian, Babylonian, and all Semitic tongues of Mesopotamia, it reads, "After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not emerged from Eridu, not began in Eridu, descended to Eridu." As if kingship, the entire apparatus of governance, administration, law, arrived from elsewhere and was transferred to this location. The Prism then lists 8 kings who ruled across 5 cities before a flood swept over the earth. Their reign lengths are recorded in a unit called the Sar. Alulim ruled for 8 Sars, Alalgar for 10 Sars, En-Men-Lu-Ana for 12 Sars. When converted to years, using the Sumerian base 60 numerical system, these become reigns of 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Mainstream scholarship calls these symbolic, mythological, perhaps representing dynastic periods rather than individual rulers. The numbers follow a mathematical pattern, increases in regular increments, suggesting the text is theological rather than historical. But there's something else written in these tablets, something consistent across thousands of cuneiform documents recovered from the ruins of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, a picture of multiplicity, of domains beyond domains, of territories scattered across what the texts call mountains, heavens, underworlds, and cosmic stations. The Sumerian word for their gods is Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth, not metaphorically. The texts use precise directional language. They describe journeys. They list way stations. They catalogue resources extracted from distant places. They document administrative hierarchies spanning locations that don't fit comfortably on a map of ancient Mesopotamia. What if these tablets don't describe mythology at all? What if they're administrative records, documentation of a civilization that managed multiple territories the way later empires would manage colonies? Not as metaphor, but as infrastructure, resource allocation, labor distribution, jurisdictional boundaries between domains. What if the Sumerian texts reveal that Earth was only one of the Anunnaki's many territories? Not as speculation, not as theory, but as a question. The texts themselves demand we ask when we stop reading them as mythology and start reading them as someone 4,000 years from now might read our own governmental archives, records of who controlled what, where resources came from, how labor was organized, who held jurisdiction over which territories. This isn't a story about ancient aliens. It's a question about how we classify texts, a mystery about what ancient people were actually recording when they pressed these strange symbols into clay. An investigation into whether mythology might sometimes be the category we use for records we don't know how to read. The prism sits in its vault. The same clay, the same text, the same wedge marks made by a scribe's reed stylus in approximately 1800 BC. Nothing about the object has changed, but perhaps everything about how we read it should. Let's descend into the archive together, slowly, carefully, following the evidence wherever it leads, even if the destination unsettles every assumption we've made about the ancient world. The architecture of translation. The first person to read cuneiform in over 1,500 years stood in the British Museum in the winter of 1857, staring at an inscription that had been chiseled into a cliff face in Persia. Major Henry Rawlinson had spent years copying the Behistun inscription, a trilingual proclamation by the Persian king Darius carved into a limestone cliff 100 meters above the ground. The same text appeared in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By comparing the known Old Persian text with the unknown Babylonian, Rawlinson cracked the code. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped. The script wasn't an alphabet, but a complex system of logograms and syllabic signs where the same symbol could represent an object, a sound, or an idea depending on context. Or the symbol for An could mean heaven, God, the sky god Anu specifically, or the syllabic sound An. The symbol for Keor, it could mean earth, the earth goddess Ki, or the syllable Ki. Reading cuneiform requires understanding not just the symbols, but the context, the language layer, the historical period, the genre of text. The Sumerians invented this script around 3200 BC, initially for accounting. Tracking grain, livestock, labor, temple receipts, and warehouse inventories. But within centuries, they were using it to record something else. Narratives about their gods. Long, detailed narratives that read less like prayers and more like chronicles. By the late 1800s, archaeologists working in what is now Iraq had recovered thousands of clay tablets from the ruins of ancient cities: Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, Ul-Lagash. The tablets came from temple archives, palace libraries, administrative buildings. As scholars learned to read them, patterns emerged. The same names appeared across different texts, different cities, different time periods: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Ninmah, Ninhursag, Ninurta, the Anunnaki, sometimes described as a collective, sometimes as specific individuals within that collective. The texts weren't contradictory mythology, the way Greek myths often contradicted each other depending on the region or poet. Sumerian texts showed remarkable consistency. The relationships between deities remained stable. The hierarchies were clearly defined. Anu was the highest authority, residing in An, heaven. Enlil was the executive administrator, managing Ki, earth. Enki governed the Absu, the subterranean freshwater realm described as both a physical location and a domain of deep wisdom. These weren't vague spiritual concepts. The texts described geography. When Inanna descends to the underworld, she passes through 7 gates, removes a piece of regalia at each one, and arrives at a throne room where her sister Ereshkigal rules and the Anunnaki serve as judges. The text specifies each gate, each garment, the exact sequence of events. When Enmakar wants resources from Aratta, a city-state in the mountains, the text describes the route. The herald travels across 7 mountain ranges. The journey takes weeks. The text names the mountains. This isn't allegory. This is documentation. And if these are records, not myths, if the Sumerians were describing their cosmos the way an imperial administrator might describe provincial territories, then what exactly were they recording? The answer begins with understanding how the Sumerians mapped their universe, not as metaphor, as jurisdiction. The vault beneath the Ashmolean is not entirely silent. There's the low hum of climate control systems, the occasional settling of ancient stone, the breath of archivists who move through these corridors speaking in whispers, as if the objects themselves might be disturbed by careless sound. The Weld Blundell prism sits in a protective case designed to preserve clay that has survived nearly 4 millennia. The cuneiform impressions remain sharp, clear, readable. But reading is not the same as understanding. When scholars first translated the opening line, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. They noted the verb immediately, descended. In Sumerian, the word is ed. It means to go down, to come down, to bring down from a higher place. The text does not say kingship originated in Eridu. It does not say humans developed governance there. It says kingship arrived, transferred from somewhere else to this location on Earth. The prism continues with precision that feels bureaucratic. 8 kings, 5 cities, reign lengths measured in sars. Alulim, 8 sars. Alalgar, 10 sars. Enmen-Lu'ana, 12 sars. Enmen-Gal-Ana, 21 sars. The Sumerian base 60 system converts these numbers into years that strain credibility. 28,800, 36,000, 43,200, 75,600. Scholars have proposed explanations. Dynastic cycles, symbolic ages, mathematical allegory representing the passage of cosmic time rather than individual lifetimes. But the text itself offers no such clarification. It simply lists names, cities, and numbers, then states, "Then the flood swept over," after which the prism records, "After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish." Again, the verb repeats. Governance did not resume. It descended a second time. This creates a structural problem. If kingship descended once, that might be poetic language, metaphor for the beginning of civilization. But if it descended twice, the text implies interruption, cessation, reinstallation, and authority that can be withdrawn and restored. The translation hinges on two symbols that appear throughout Sumerian cosmology: An, heaven, sky, the god Anu, or simply the syllabic sound An. Kai, earth, land, territory, the goddess Ki, or the syllable Ki. When combined, An K can mean the universe, the totality of heaven and earth. But when separated in administrative texts, they function as distinct jurisdictions. Anu rules An. Enlil administers Ki. The texts do not treat these as abstract theological concepts. They describe them with geographic specificity. Heaven has a palace, a throne room, gates, councils that convene and make decisions affecting earth. Earth has cities, temples, agricultural zones, labor forces organized under divine authority. The boundary between them is not impermeable. Or the texts describe movement, ascent, descent, transfer of objects, decrees, and occasionally beings. Inanna ascends to heaven and demands authority from Anu. Enki descends from the Abzu to teach humanity crafts. The Mi, divine decrees or cosmic principles, are transported between realms. If kingship descended, the logical implication is that it existed elsewhere first, somewhere above earth, somewhere governed, somewhere with the administrative capacity to transfer political structures to a location that previously lacked them. The prism does not explain where heaven is. It assumes the reader already knows. 4,000 years later, we do not. We have the word an. We have the verb descended. We have the list of cities that received governance in sequence: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. But we do not have the map. We do not know what the Sumerians meant when they wrote that kingship came from heaven. Was heaven a direction, a territory, a domain with borders, resources, and ruling councils of its own? Or was it something else entirely, something the texts assume is self-evident, something we've lost the framework to interpret? The prism offers no clarification. It simply waits in the dark, recording the same sequence it has recorded for nearly 4,000 years. Kingship descended. The flood swept over. Kingship descended again. If governance came from heaven, What exactly did the Sumerians mean by heaven? And what did they believe heaven was governing before Earth received kingship at all? The Sumerians did not describe heaven as a concept. They described it as a place with architecture. The texts recovered from Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu use the same vocabulary for heaven that they use for cities on Earth. An has a palace, throne rooms, gates that open and close, councils that convene to make decisions. It has residents. Anu sits at the summit of authority. Around him, the Anunnaki gather in assembly. They debate. They vote. They issue decrees that ripple downward into other domains. Below heaven sits Ki, Earth, the realm administered by Enlil. Below Earth lies the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean governed by Enki. Not metaphorical wisdom. The texts describe it as a physical location, a place Enki travels to and from, a domain with boundaries. Below the Abzu stretches Kur, the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by Ereshkigal. And beyond the core territories, the texts name others. Dilmun, a distant land associated with purity, the rising sun, and trade routes across water. Aratta, a mountain city rich in precious stones and metals, reached by crossing 7 mountain ranges. These are not allegories. The descent of Inanna describes her journey to the underworld with procedural precision. She approaches the first gate. The gatekeeper asks her purpose. She states her intent: to attend the funeral rites of her sister's husband. The gatekeeper consults with Ereshkigal. Permission is granted, but with conditions. At each of the 7 gates, Inanna must surrender one piece of her divine regalia: her crown, her lapis necklace, her breastplate, her gold ring, her measuring rod and line. By the time she reaches the throne room, she stands naked, stripped of authority. The Anunnaki sit in judgment. 7 judges. Their eyes fix on her. They render a verdict. She is killed. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The text does not present this as symbolic death. It describes decomposition. 3 days and 3 nights pass before Enki intervenes, sending emissaries to retrieve her. The underworld is not a state of mind. It has gates, guards, protocols, legal procedures, judges who deliberate and pass sentence. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero travels beyond the twin peaks of Mount Mashu, the mountain at the edge of the world where the sun rises and sets. He passes through 12 leagues of darkness. He emerges into a garden of jeweled trees. He crosses the waters of death. He arrives at the dwelling of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality and now resides at the mouth of the rivers. Now in a place described as being at the boundary of the cosmos. The geography is detailed. The route is mapped. The distances are recorded. These are not dream sequences. They are itineraries. Meanwhile, on Earth, the structure mirrors what the texts describe in other realms. Sumerian temples are called E. Houses. The house of the god. Each temple has gates, inner chambers, a sanctuary where the deity's statue resides, priests who serve as administrators, storerooms, workshops, courtyards where councils gather. The ziggurat at Ur rises in stepped platforms, a physical link between earth and heaven, not symbolic, architectural. The texts describe gods descending to these structures. They describe offerings carried upward. They describe the transfer of decrees, written documents from heaven to earth via these temple complexes. The ziggurat at Eridu was called Abzu, the house of the Abzu, a structure connecting the surface to the subterranean waters below. The cosmos, as the Sumerians described it, functions like a multi-level administrative system. Each realm has a sovereign authority, a physical location, gates that regulate entry, councils that govern, protocols that must be followed. Inanna cannot simply walk into the underworld. She must state her purpose, surrender her authority symbols, submit to judgment. Gilgamesh cannot simply approach Utnapishtim. He must cross boundaries, pass through realms, survive the journey. Heaven is not an abstract afterlife. It is a domain with jurisdiction, a place from which authority descends and to which appeals are made. The underworld is not oblivion. It is a governed territory with legal structures and appointed rulers. Dilmun and Aratta are not mythical utopias. They are distant locations, accessed through trade routes and diplomatic missions. This is not theology in the way later religions would define the term. This is jurisdictional geography, a map of territories under administration. If heaven, earth, the underworld, the Abzu, Dilmun, and Aratta are all structured domains with gates, thrones, courts, and governing authorities, who assigned these jurisdictions? And if kingship descended from heaven, what other forms of administration descended with it? The names remain constant across centuries. Tablets recovered from different cities, written in different periods by scribes who never met, all record the same hierarchy. Anu at the summit, Enlil below him, or Enki governing a separate domain, Ereshkigal ruling the underworld. This is not the way mythology typically functions. Greek myths shift depending on region and poet. Zeus's genealogy changes. Hera's origins vary. The relationships between gods contradict across sources. Sumerian texts do not contradict. The structure holds. Anu resides in An, heaven. His name is the word for heaven. His authority is described as supreme, but distant. He does not often intervene directly. He presides, he ratifies, he grants final approval. Enlil administers Ki, earth. His title is Enlil, meaning Lord Wind or Lord Air. But the texts describe him less as a weather deity and more as an executive authority. He manages, he delegates, he enforces. Enki governs the Abzu, or his name means Lord Earth, but his domain is the subterranean waters. The texts describe him as a craftsman, an engineer, a problem solver who designs solutions when systems fail. Ereshkigal rules Kur, the underworld. Her name means Queen of the Great Below. The texts give her full sovereignty over her realm. Even the other Anunnaki cannot enter without her permission. These are not personalities in a pantheon. They are jurisdictional titles. The Sumerian word En appears throughout administrative texts. It means lord, but it also means manager, overseer, the one who holds authority over a specific territory or function. The word Kur has three meanings depending on context: mountain, foreign land, or underworld. All three share a common element. They are places beyond the boundary of familiar territory, places that require crossing thresholds to reach. When the texts describe Enlil's authority, they use the term Nam Enlil La, the power of Enlil, or, more precisely, the executive function assigned to Enlil. It is not divinity in the way later religions would define the term. It is jurisdiction. The tablets recovered from Nippur, Enlil's cult center, contain administrative records alongside hymns, grain distributions, labor assignments, ration lists, temple inventories. The same vocabulary appears in both. Workers are assigned to NSA, governors of cities. Resources are allocated by Shabra, temple administrators. Land is measured using the IKU, a unit of area equivalent to roughly 3,600 square meters. Divine authority and economic administration use overlapping language, because they are describing the same system. The gods do not merely receive worship, they receive reports. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki are described collectively, not as individuals, but as a council. Lesser gods perform labor. They dig canals, they clear irrigation channels, they dredge rivers. The work becomes unbearable. They complain, they strike, they burn their tools. A council convenes. Anu presides. Enlil attends. Enki proposes a solution. The assembly debates. They vote. They approve the creation of humanity to take over the workload. This is not spontaneous divine will. This is procedural decision-making. The text records the complaint, the deliberation, the proposal, and the implementation, as if documenting a labor dispute resolved through council consensus. After humanity is created, the texts describe the Anunnaki distributing authority. Enlil assigns cities to specific gods. Ninurta oversees agricultural territories. Nanshi governs fishing zones and marshlands. Inanna receives jurisdiction over Uruk. Each deity functions as a regional administrator, managing resources and labor within their assigned domain. The tablets do not call this theology. They call it me, divine decrees, cosmic principles, or possibly administrative protocols. The word appears in economic texts describing the transfer of authority, in legal documents establishing jurisdiction, and in temple hymns describing the structure of order itself. The same term, the same function. Governance descending from heaven was not metaphor. It was the installation of a multi-level administrative system with clearly defined roles, territories, and chains of command. But councils do not form for their own sake. Labor systems do not organize themselves without purpose. Jurisdictions are not assigned unless there is something to manage. If the Anunnaki functioned as a governing body, distributing cities, assigning territories, creating labor forces, what were they governing? And why, in a cosmos with multiple domains already populated by divine beings, did they need humans at all? The Atrahasis epic does not begin with creation. It begins with exhaustion. For 40 years, the text says, the lesser gods, the Igigi, dig canals. They dredge rivers, they carry earth. They shape the Tigris and Euphrates into navigable waterways. The work does not stop. For 40 years, they labor without rest. Then, on the 41st year, something breaks. The text records it with precision. The gods had to dig out canals, had to clear channels, the gods' hard work. The work was heavy, the toil was much. They complain among themselves. The labor is unbearable. They are divine beings, yet they function as a workforce performing infrastructure projects. One night they gather. They burn their tools. They march toward Enlil's residence and surround it, demanding relief. This is not rebellion in the mythological sense. No cosmic war, no battle for supremacy. This is a labor strike. Enlil wakes. He summons Anu. A council convenes. The gods debate the situation. The work must continue, but the Igigi refuse to return. A solution is needed. Enki proposes one. Create a new workforce, not divine, not part of the existing hierarchy. A separate class of beings designed specifically to perform the labor the gods no longer wish to bear. The council votes. The proposal is approved. Humanity is created. The text describes the process with procedural language. Enki and the mother goddess Nintu shape the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. 7 males, 7 females. They are brought into existence, not for companionship, not for worship, but for labor management. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, repeats this structure with slightly different phrasing. Let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe. Humanity's purpose is explicit: to relieve the gods of work, not metaphorically, not spiritually, functionally. The administrative parallels are difficult to ignore. Tablets recovered from Ur, Lagash, and Nippur contain detailed labor records dating to the same periods as these epics. Workers are assigned daily rations, grain, oil, textiles, in exchange for labor. Ration lists survive in the thousands. They record names, occupations, quantities distributed. One tablet from Ur lists 30 workers assigned to canal maintenance. Another from Lagash records textile production quotas. Another from Nippur tracks. Construction crews building temple walls. The structure mirrors what the Atrahasis epic describes. A central authority assigns tasks. Workers perform those tasks. Rations are distributed as compensation. The gods do not appear in these economic tablets, but the system itself operates under their nominal ownership. Land is described as belonging to the temple, meaning belonging to the god. A labor is performed in service to the temple, meaning in service to divine authority. Grain is stored in temple warehouses, redistributed by temple administrators who function as intermediaries between divine ownership and human labor. The economy is not secular. It is integrated into the same administrative hierarchy the epics describe. On Earth, humans work under the supervision of NC, governors appointed by the gods. In heaven, before humanity's creation, the Egigi worked under the supervision of Enlil, who himself answered to Anu. The structure replicates. What changes is the workforce. Before humanity, divine labor. After humanity, human labor. But the system, centralized authority, delegated oversight, resource extraction, infrastructure projects, remains identical. Almost the Atrahasis epic does not present creation as a gift. It presents it as workforce redistribution, a solution to a labor shortage, an administrative adjustment to maintain productivity. If the gods needed labor to dig canals on Earth, the question becomes unavoidable. Were there canals being dug elsewhere? Were there other territories requiring the same infrastructure management, resource extraction, and organized labor that Sumer required? The texts describe heaven as a place with architecture, the Absu as a governed domain, Kur as a realm with structure. If these domains also required maintenance, construction, resource management, did they also require labor forces? And if Earth's solution was to create humanity, what solutions were implemented in other territories? The Atrahasis epic does not answer this, but it implies something unsettling. Humanity was not created to inhabit Earth. Humanity was created to work it. And if Earth was one worksite requiring a dedicated labor force, the administrative logic suggests it was not the only one. Sumerian trade records do not describe exchange with neighbors. They describe coordination across vast distances. Tablets recovered from Uruk and Ur list imports that could not have originated in Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone found only in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, over 2,000 kilometers away. Carnelian beads traced to the Indus Valley. Copper ingots sourced from Magan, likely the region of modern Oman. Timber, cedar, and other woods shipped from distant highlands. These were not occasional luxuries acquired through wandering merchants. The quantities were industrial. Temple inventories record tons of copper, thousands of lapis beads, entire fleets of timber shipments used in temple construction. The scale implies infrastructure, trade routes that functioned reliably, diplomatic agreements that allowed safe passage, coordination between distant territories that shared economic and possibly administrative systems. The Epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta describes one such relationship. Enmerkar, king of Uruk, seeks resources from Aratta, a city in the mountains rich in precious stones and metals. He sends a herald with a message. The message is so complex that the herald cannot memorize it. So Enmerkar invents writing. He presses words into clay, seals the tablet, and sends it to Aratta's ruler. And the text presents this as the origin of written communication, not for poetry, not for worship, but for diplomatic precision across distance. The route is detailed. The herald crosses 7 mountain ranges. The journey takes weeks. The text names geographic features along the way. Aratta is not imaginary. The text describes it with the same specificity used for Sumerian cities. It has a ruler, a palace, craftsmen, resources under organized extraction. And it operates within a system where Uruk's king can make demands and expect responses. Meanwhile, other texts reference Dilmun, an island or coastal region associated with trade, purity, and the rising sun. Tablets describe grain shipments sent to Dilmun in exchange for copper and exotic goods. And archaeological evidence places Dilmun in the region of Bahrain and the eastern Arabian coast, a critical node in Persian Gulf maritime trade. Further still, the texts mention Magan and Meluha. Magan, likely Oman, supplied copper and diorite stone. Meluha, possibly the Indus Valley, exported carnelian, ivory, and textiles. These were not mythical lands. They were integrated into Sumer's economic network. Trade routes crossed desert, mountain, and open sea. Goods moved in both directions. Diplomatic envoys traveled between courts. The system resembles later empires. A core region, Sumer, coordinating with peripheral territories that supplied raw materials and received manufactured goods or agricultural surplus in return. But here is where the structure becomes disorienting. The same texts that describe trade with Aratta, Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha also describe divine authority extending into those regions. Inanna is called the Queen of Heaven and Earth, but also the Lady of Aratta. Enki is described as traveling to Dilmun and making it a pure land, a place blessed by divine decree. The gods do not rule only Sumer. Their jurisdiction, at least symbolically, spans the known trade network. Temple hymns credit the Anunnaki with establishing these distant cities, with assigning their resources, with maintaining order across regions that would have taken months to travel between. If these were simply independent city-states engaged in trade, why describe them as part of a unified divine administration? Why claim the same gods who governed Uruk also governed Aratta? Why structure the economy as if distant territories were not foreign, but integrated, provinces within a larger system? The tablets do not answer this explicitly, but the language they use is revealing. The word Kur, mountain, foreign land, underworld, appears in descriptions of both Arata and the cosmic domains beyond Earth. Arata is called Akur. So is the underworld ruled by Ereshkigal. The term does not distinguish between terrestrial distance and cosmic distance. Both are described as territories beyond the familiar. Both require crossing thresholds. Both fall under the same administrative vocabulary. Trade routes on Earth mirror the structure described in the cosmos. Core cities connected to distant lands. Resources extracted and redistributed. Authority centralized, but delegated to regional governors. If Sumer saw Arata, Dilmun, Margen, and Meluha as integrated territories within a divine economic system, not foreign, but peripheral parts of a unified order, then the question becomes unavoidable. Did their cosmic map function the same way? Were heaven, the Abzu, Kur, and other realms described in the same terms because the Sumerians understood their universe as a network of interconnected territories under centralized governance? And if Earth was one node in that network, trading, laboring, reporting upward, what were the other nodes, and where did their resources go? The Sumerian epics do not describe gods appearing spontaneously. They describe them traveling, with routes, waypoints, protocols that must be observed. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality, he does not pray and receive a vision. He walks. The Epic of Gilgamesh maps his journey with geographic precision. But he travels to Mount Mashu, the twin-peaked mountain at the edge of the world where the sun rises and sets. Scorpion beings guard the entrance. They question him. They warn him. They allow him to pass only after he explains his purpose. He enters a tunnel beneath the mountain. The text specifies the distance: 12 leagues of absolute darkness. He walks for 12 leagues, approximately 70 kilometers, without light. He emerges into a garden where trees bear jewels instead of fruit. Lapis lazuli branches, carnelian leaves. This is not metaphor. The text describes it as a place Gilgamesh physically reaches after crossing a boundary. Beyond the garden, he meets Siduri, a divine tavern keeper who directs him to Urshanabi, the ferryman. Urshanabi ferries him across the waters of death, another boundary that requires crossing, not transcending. Finally, Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim at the mouth of the rivers. The journey is procedural. Each threshold requires permission. Each stage has guardians. Each crossing follows a sequence. Inanna's descent follows the same structure. She does not simply will herself into the underworld. She approaches the outer gate and announces her intent to the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper consults Ereshkigal, the underworld's queen. Permission is granted conditionally. At the first gate, she surrenders her crown. At the second gate, her lapis necklace. At the third, her double strand of beads. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her gold ring. At the 6th, her measuring rod and line. At the 7th, her royal robe. And each gate strips her of one piece of authority until she arrives at the throne room naked, without jurisdiction. The underworld is not a state of being. It is a location accessed through a specific route with mandatory checkpoints. Enki travels between the Absu and the surface repeatedly throughout Sumerian literature. The texts use directional verbs. He ascends to earth. He descends to the Absu. He crosses between domains. These are not spiritual movements. They are logistical. Meanwhile, the physical architecture of Sumerian cities mirrors this structure. Ziggurats, stepped pyramid temples, are described as linking heaven and earth. The ziggurat at Ur was called E Temen Ni Gur, house of the foundation platform of heaven and earth. Not a symbolic name, a functional description. The ziggurat at Eridu was E Absu, house of the Absu, a structure connecting the surface to the subterranean waters below. These buildings were not simply temples. They were access points. Staircases ascended their sides. Priests climbed to the summit, where the god's sanctuary stood. The texts describe gods descending to these structures to receive offerings, issue decrees, and meet with human administrators. The architecture suggests the cosmos was understood as vertically layered, with each ziggurat functioning as a junction between realms. But here is what makes the structure unsettling. Movement between domains is never casual. It always involves announcement of purpose, permission from authority, passage through designated routes, surrender of status symbols at boundaries. Inanna cannot bypass the 7 gates. Gilgamesh cannot avoid the scorpion beings. Enki does not appear on Earth without travelling from the Absu. This implies something the texts never state outright. The cosmos functioned as a regulated system, a network where travel required authorization, where boundaries were enforced, where crossing thresholds triggered procedural responses. If the system was this structured, this dependent on protocol, then it was also fragile. What happened when the procedures failed? What happened when communication between domains was severed? What happened when kingship, which descended from heaven, could no longer descend? The Sumerian king list records that after the flood, kingship descended again. Not that it resumed, not that it continued, that it descended a second time. The verb implies interruption, a break in the system. On a period when Earth was no longer connected to the administrative hierarchy above it. The flood was not a natural disaster. The Atrahasis epic describes it as a deliberate decision, a council vote, a policy enacted to address a systemic problem. And after the flood, the texts describe a reinstallation, kingship descending again, the protocols re-established, the routes reopened. If travel between domains required gates, ferrymen, guardians, and procedural authorization, if the system could be interrupted and then restored, then what the Sumerians were describing was not theology. It was infrastructure, a network of governed territories connected by regulated travel. And if that network could break, what happened to Earth during the interruption? The flood was not divine anger. It was a policy decision. the Atrahasis epic, describes the events leading to it with administrative precision. Humanity multiplies, cities expand, the population grows beyond projections. Then comes the complaint. Enlil cannot sleep. The text specifies the problem. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. This is not metaphor. The text describes overpopulation as a systemic issue disrupting order. Enlil convenes a council. The gods debate solutions. First, they attempt population control through disease. Plagues are sent. The population decreases temporarily, then rebounds. They try famine, drought, agricultural collapse. Each time, humanity recovers. Enki, who had created humans as a labor solution, quietly undermines these measures. He teaches humanity irrigation. He provides grain from hidden stores. He offers technical solutions that allow survival. Finally, Enlil proposes a permanent solution, a flood. Not a storm, not rising rivers, a deliberate erasure. The council votes. Anu agrees. The gods consent. Enlil is authorized to execute the decision. But Enki, bound by council consensus, yet unwilling to see his creation destroyed entirely, finds a loophole. He does not warn humanity directly. That would violate the council's decree. Instead, he speaks to a wall. The text is explicit. Enki addresses the reed wall of a house where Atrahasis sleeps inside. Reed wall, listen to my words. Dismantle your house. Build a boat. Atrahasis overhears. He builds the vessel. He loads it with animals, craftsmen, seed stores. The flood comes. The text describes it with disturbing specificity. The flood roared like a bull, like a wild ass screaming. The winds howled. The darkness was total. No one could see anyone else. For 7 days and 7 nights, water covers the earth. When it recedes, Atrahasis emerges. He makes an offering. The gods, who had apparently not eaten during the flood, swarm the sacrifice like flies. Enlil is furious that someone survived, but Enki deflects responsibility. He reminds the council that total extermination was inefficient. Humanity serves a function. Without them, labor stops. The council deliberates again. They agree to allow humanity's survival, but implement controls, birth restrictions, shorter lifespans, structural limitations to prevent future overpopulation. Then, the system is reinstalled. The Sumerian king list records what happens next with a single line that should disturb anyone reading carefully. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish, not resumed, not continued, descended again. The verb repeats. The governance structure did not survive the flood independently. It had to be restored from above. This creates a structural problem that cannot be ignored. If kingship descended before the flood, existed during a pre-flood period, was interrupted by the flood, and then descended again afterward, then Earth's political system was not autonomous. It was dependent, authorized externally, installed from another domain, subject to revocation. The texts describe other interruptions throughout Sumerian history, periods of chaos, foreign invasions, the collapse of dynasties. But the flood is different. It represents total systemic failure followed by full reinstallation, not a change in dynasty, a reset of the entire administrative framework. And if governance required reinstallation, then the infrastructure connecting Earth to the domains above it must have been severed during the flood. The routes Gilgamesh travelled, the gates Inanna passed through, the protocols Enki followed when moving between the Absu and Earth, all interrupted, all restored afterward. The Epic of Gilgamesh confirms this indirectly. When Gilgamesh finally meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality, he asks how one attains eternal life. Utnapishtim explains that his immortality was not a reward, it was a reclassification. After the flood, the gods relocated him beyond the normal boundaries of the world to the mouth of the rivers, where he could no longer interfere with human affairs. His survival was administrative containment, an exception processed through divine decree. The flood was not punishment, it was system maintenance, a hard reset executed after population parameters exceeded sustainable limits. And when the system was restored, kingship descended again, not from Earth's survivors, but from heaven. Governance reinstalled, authority re-established, protocols resumed. If Earth's governance could be revoked and reinstated at the discretion of a council convening in another domain, then the question becomes unavoidable. Was Earth ever autonomous, or was it always one territory among many, dependent on external authorization, subject to oversight, or operating within a hierarchy that extended far beyond its surface? The texts do not frame this as speculation. They describe it as structure, and structure, once interrupted, must be rebuilt. The tablets excavated from Ur do not contain prayers. They contain payroll records. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from temple archives across Sumer, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Girsu document something that does not resemble worship. It resembles labor management. One tablet from the temple of Inanna at Uruk lists 37 workers assigned to textile production. Each worker's name is recorded. Their daily ration is specified: barley, oil, wool. Another tablet from Lagash tracks grain distributions to 42 laborers working on canal maintenance. The quantities are precise. The allocations are calculated based on work performed. A tablet from Nippur records temple construction crews. 70 workers, stone hauled, timber delivered, rations distributed according to task completion. These are not offerings to the gods. These are economic records. The temples were called houses, the house of the god. But they functioned as production centers, grain storage, textile workshops, metalworking facilities, breweries, bakeries. Thousands of workers cycled through these complexes daily, performing tasks assigned by temple administrators who reported to governors who ultimately served divine landowners. The land itself was not owned by humans. The tablets specify this repeatedly, and fields are described as Shah Dingir, field of the god. Workers are listed as Erin Tu Dingir, workforce of the god. The entire economic system operated under the legal fiction, or perhaps the literal understanding, that the gods owned the land and humans worked it in service. The structure is clearest in the ration lists. Workers received daily allocations of barley, oil, and textiles based on labor classification. Gamer 2, female laborers, received lower rations. Erin 2, male laborers, received standard rations. Aga Us 2, soldiers or guards, received higher rations. Shabra, temple administrators, received the highest. The hierarchy was not spiritual, it was economic. Productivity determined compensation. Task assignments determined status. And all of it flowed through the temple, which served as the administrative hub between human labor and divine ownership. The parallel to later imperial systems is difficult to ignore. Roman colonies operated the same way. A central authority, Rome, appointed governors to distant territories. Those governors managed local labor forces. Resources flowed back to the imperial core. The legal framework positioned the emperor as the ultimate landholder. British colonial administration followed a similar model. Local governors, indigenous labor forces, resources extracted and shipped to the metropolitan center. Legal structures that positioned the crown as the sovereign authority over territories thousands of kilometers away. The Sumerian system predates both by millennia, but the structure is identical. Central authority, the gods, residing in heaven, or local governors, the Ensai, human rulers appointed to manage specific cities. Labor force, humanity, created explicitly to relieve divine beings of work. Resource flow, grain, metals, textiles produced on earth and offered upward to the divine economy. Legal framework, all land owned by the gods, all labor performed in their service. The tablets do not describe this as metaphor, they document it as infrastructure. Meanwhile, the mythological texts describe heaven using the same administrative vocabulary. Heaven has storehouses, workshops, resource management. The me, divine decrees or cosmic principles, are stored in heaven and distributed to earth. Inanna famously travels to the Abzu and steals the me from Enki, bringing them to Uruk. The text lists them: kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, metalworking, legal authority. Well, these are not abstract spiritual qualities. They are transferable administrative capacities, technologies, governance structures, economic functions, and they originate elsewhere, then descend to earth. The temple economy mirrors the cosmic economy. Resources produced locally, authority descending from above, labor organized under divine oversight. If this structure is not metaphor, if the Sumerians genuinely understood their world as one territory within a larger divine administrative system, then the texts cannot be classified as mythology. They would be records, documentation of how the system functioned, who held authority, where resources came from, how labor was organized. The same way a Roman colonial administrator's reports documented grain shipments from Egypt to Rome, labor quotas in Gaul, and tax revenues from Britannia. The same way British East India Company ledgers documented textile production in Bengal, tea shipments from Assam, and labor contracts in Ceylon. The Sumerian tablets document grain production in Uruk, copper imports from Magan, labor assignments in Lagash, and rations distributed in the service of divine landowners. The structure replicates across scales. Earthly economy mirrors cosmic hierarchy. Human labor serves divine ownership. Governors manage territories under external authorization. If Earth's economy functioned as a managed territory within a divine administrative system, then the texts are not mythological allegories. They are the archives of a colony. And if they are archives, what category do these texts truly belong to? Theology or administrative history? The Weld-Blundell prism has not changed. It sits in the same vault, the same clay, the same wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface nearly 4,000 years ago. But the way we read it might need to. When scholars first translated the Sumerian king list, they classified it as mythology. The reign lengths were impossible. The narrative was theological. The language was symbolic. But mythology typically contradicts itself. Greek myths shift depending on the region, the poet, the century. Zeus's parentage changes. Hera's origins vary. The relationships between gods conflict across sources. Sumerian texts do not contradict. The hierarchy remains stable across thousands of tablets spanning centuries. Anu at the summit, Enlil administering earth, Enki governing the Abzu, Ereshkigal ruling the underworld. The same names, the same relationships, and the same jurisdictional boundaries. This is not the structure of mythology. This is the structure of records. Consider what the texts describe when read consecutively, not as isolated myths, but as parts of a single archive. Kingship descends from heaven to earth, not metaphorically. The verb is directional. Governance transfers from one domain to another. The cosmos is divided into territories. Heaven, earth, the Abzu, the underworld, Dilmun, Aratta, each described with gates, thrones, courts, and administrative protocols. Movement between domains follows routes. Gilgamesh crosses 12 leagues of darkness. Inanna surrenders authority symbols at 7 gates. Enki ascends and descends between the Abzu and earth. A labor crisis occurs in heaven. Divine beings strike. A council convenes. Humanity is created as a workforce solution. Trade networks connect Sumer to distant lands. Aratta supplies precious stones. Dilmun functions as a maritime hub. Margan provides copper. The scale suggests coordination, not random exchange. The flood is not divine wrath. It is a council decision. Overpopulation triggers deliberation. A vote authorizes intervention. The system is interrupted, then reinstalled. Temple economies operate as production centers. Thousands of workers receive rations. Labor is classified. Output is tracked. Land is owned by divine authorities. Humans work it in service. Each piece, isolated, can be dismissed as mythology. But together, they describe something else. An administrative framework, a multi-domain system with centralized authority, delegated governance, regulated travel, resource extraction, labor management, and periodic resets. The language the texts use is not poetic. It is procedural. The Atrahasis epic does not say the gods were angry. It says they deliberated and voted. The Sumerian king list does not say governance began. It says it descended. The economic tablets do not describe offerings. They document payroll. If these are myths, they are myths that function like bureaucratic archives. And if they function like archives, perhaps we have misclassified them. The Sumerian cosmos was not centered on Earth. Earth was one territory within a larger structure. Heaven was not an abstract afterlife. It was the seat of central authority, described with the same architectural and administrative vocabulary used for Sumerian cities. The underworld was not oblivion. It was a judicial domain with courts, judges, and legal procedures. The Abzu was not symbolic wisdom. It was a governed realm with a sovereign administrator who travelled between it and the surface. Dilmun, Arata, Magan, and Meluha were not mythical utopias. They were peripheral territories integrated into Sumer's trade and resource networks, and described as falling under the same divine oversight. The structure mirrors what later civilizations would call an empire, a core region holding centralized authority. Outlying territories governed by appointed administrators. Labor forces organized to extract resources and maintain infrastructure. Trade routes connecting distant lands. Legal frameworks positioning a sovereign power as the ultimate owner of all territories. Rome operated this way. The British Empire operated this way. The Sumerian texts describe their cosmos operating this way, but with domains extending beyond Earth's surface. This is not speculation about ancient aliens. This is a question about classification. Are these texts mythology because they describe gods? Or are they administrative records that happen to use the word gods for the authorities governing the system? The difference is not semantic. If the Sumerians believed Earth was one territory within a multi-domain hierarchy, if they understood their world as governed by external authorization, dependent on centralized oversight, part of a cosmic structure extending into regions they called heaven, the Abzu, and Kur, then the texts are not describing theology. They are describing cosmology as jurisdiction, a map of governed territories. The implications are disorienting. For 4,000 years, we have read these texts as stories ancient people told to explain the world. But what if they were not explanations? What if they were records? Documentation of a system the Sumerians did not invent but inherited, or were installed into. The texts themselves suggest this. Kingship descended. It did not originate on earth. Humanity was created to relieve divine labor, not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a workforce solution. The flood interrupted governance. Then governance was reinstalled from above. If these texts are records, then the question is not whether the Sumerians believed in gods. The question is, what were they recording when they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, that the Anunnaki governed multiple domains, that Earth was one territory within a structured cosmos? The Sumerian worldview was not Earth-centric. It was not human-centric. It was imperial. And Earth, in that framework, was not the center. It was one governed domain among many. The clay prism sits in its vault, the same object, the same text. But perhaps we have been reading it backward. We have assumed the Sumerians were looking up at the heavens and imagining gods. What if they were looking up and documenting a system they understood themselves to be part of? A system where governance descended, where labor was managed, where territories were coordinated, where authority extended across domains we no longer know how to map. If a civilization 4,000 years from now excavated our governmental archives, tax records, immigration documents, trade agreements, labor contracts, and read them without context, or would they call them mythology? Would they see our references to states, nations, federal authority, and assume we were describing imaginary realms? Or would they recognize them as administrative records of a structured system? The Sumerian texts have not changed, but the way we classify them might need to. Not as myths about gods, but as records of a cosmology structured like an empire, where Earth was not the only territory, heaven was not an abstract concept, and kingship descended because it originated elsewhere. The texts do not argue for this. They simply describe it. And perhaps 4,000 years later, we are finally beginning to read them correctly.